Awesome. So we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you guys for showing up. My name is Elliott Chenger. I work for Armour Connected Fitness, in Austin, Texas. We work on pretty much any of the mobile apps that Under Armour does. MyFitnessPal, Endomondo, MapMyFitness, and Record. Today we're going to talk not about fitness. We're going to talk about achieving the best experience for multi-window. This is something that really scared me when Google announced this and part of their dev previews. I initially pulled down the preview and started playing around with things, and I'm hopefully going to help back you guys off being very afraid of targeting N and potentially having your apps run in multi-window by giving you some tools to kind of think of things ahead of time, and as well as some experiences that I've kind of firsthand went through with trying to upgrade some of our apps. We're not all the way there. We're actually going through kind of a design rebranding that's going to include more multi-window-esque type features. So it's definitely an iterative process. So today, these are kind of the 4 topics we're going to hit off of. Going to describe a little bit about what multi-window is, a couple of the options and features of multi-window, how multi-window affects your designs, the best way to upgrade for multi-window, and then as well, like I said, making the best experience as possible. I'm actually had changed a little my best experience slides because on the flight out last night, kind of made some breakthroughs and some stuff with coordinator layout, which I was really excited about. So we'll talk a little bit about the coordinator layout as well. So first and foremost, what is multi-window? So multi-window on Android is going to look a lot like this. All right. I'm sorry. I'm trolling you guys. But the point I'm trying to make, and this is actually multi-window for Android, the point I'm trying to make is that multi-window is not something that's brand new. It's not something that we're just now coming to figure out in computers. Personal computers since Windows 3.1, as we saw, have had the ability to do things in more of a multi-window aspect. So it is, yes, it is new to us, but we hopefully should short circuit some of the problems and design concerns that other apps and PCs have dealt with to kind of jump ahead of times and make it a little bit easier on ourselves. So there's 3 modes actually for Android that you can have multi-window in. First and foremost, you're going to have split screen. Pretty simple. 2 apps that share the entire screen. There's a handle that's right smack in the center of the screen that you can adjust, move them apps up and down, and they just kind of proportionally change sizes. Think of it as kind of like tug of war between 2 apps in the screen that they're trying to share. The next one is picture-in-picture. So when they first came out with this in dev preview, I'm pretty sure that was allowed for all versions of Android, and then when they finally came out with Nougat and they said everything's finished, they said, well, it's not going to be in 7 for anything mobile or tablet, but in Android TV you'll have picture-in-picture. We're actually not going to talk a lot about picture-in-picture today because the APIs are really simple and it's actually less user interface to deal with. If you think about it, it makes total sense. Just a video that you can watch over top of other videos while you're navigating Android TV experience. And then the last one is freeform mode. This is one that I already showed before. It's probably the one we're most familiar with when it comes to computers. It's basically any amount of apps sharing any portion of the screen that they want. And there's very little that you can do to stop what the user can do as far as kind of resizing your screens. This is only going to also support for tablets, and they also didn't allow support for Pixel C or Nexus 9 or any tablets that I know of right now. None of them have freeform, so there's a hack to get Pixel C to actually allow freeform that includes doing some developer options. If you guys want to know more about that, I can tell you afterwards. I didn't make that a part of this because it's really not. Most of the stuff we're going to deal with in split screen will transfer over to freeform, and you'll be in just as good enough shape as it is as long as you can take care of split screen. So going right into design, we always start with design because obviously it's the first place we have to start when we build our apps. So if you're starting out a new app, you're going to be starting here anyways. If you're in an old app or an existing app like myself, you're going to end up having to basically go back to the drawing board and look at design. And I'm not just talking about design from a designer's perspective, but as well from an Android developer. Our layouts that we have in there, all the things that we're kind of doing already in our app. We just need to talk about what's going to happen when someone targets N or when they use our apps in multi-window. And the first one that's like just the most kind of lowest of the hanging fruit is there's just less real estate. So Here's an example app that I have with a product placement for my company, and the web view next door in the split screen mode. And this is kind of what a split screen mode will look in a 4-up, where the user can actually adjust between the kind of 3 different sizes that the 6P and 5X have. These sizes that you can adjust to, I think, are roughly 100%, 65%, 50%, and 33%. I didn't want to post those numbers up here because it's not actually something that Google says these are the only kind of breaks that you can make in split screen. I found that in tablet you can actually see more. I think a lot of it has to do with the actual real estate that you have on the screen. So this is just kind of a very small view of what it looks like. But as you can tell, we just have less room to do things. So definitely be aware that as soon as you start targeting N, all the fancy UI that you have that's now cluttered up the screen is going to be squished into much smaller places. And from there, if you're a really keen observer of what those last screens, you'll notice that there's actually a few of the widgets that are kind of acting a little bit differently than we expect. And that's because of how even Google themselves, how they've handled layouts and some of the actual orientation and different sizing of the screen for some of their own widgets. So first and foremost, I'm going to start off with side navigation. So there's not really much that's different here, but I'm already really a huge advocate for getting rid of side navigation. I have a 6P, and the one-handed usability is miserable. So you take that, and then you multiply it by like 10, I think, trying to get to this thing. It basically takes any app that you have that you may have like made one-handed usable from a side nav, and as soon as you go into split screen mode and your app is on the top, it's two-handed now. Like, it doesn't matter if someone's gonna have to put down their Starbucks or whatever and now actually like, use their extra hand to touch any of the navigations items. And I know this is a really trite example because we actually have some pretty crazy stuff, I think, in our side nav. So just think of that like when you're scrolling and trying to deal with nested items and things like that. This is just not a good experience and it feels cramped. And then from there, like I was talking about, some of the widgets that we use on a day-to-day basis are just kind of act weird. So for instance, the app bar goes from being 56 dp high to 48 dp high. And that's because of a common misconception of what the concept of orientation means in Android. I think a lot of us, when we created layouts and we say this is for landscape or this is for portrait, that we think that actually means the physical orientation of the phone. And in actual fact, that's not the case. It actually is the physical real estate. So it's more about the height versus the width. So in this case, in material design, in the material support library for not material support library, but in the app bar support library, it actually thinks that it's in landscape mode right now, so it reduces itself to 48 dp. And you'll also see that with the titles in the title bar as well, where they go from 16 dp to 14 dp. And that's also, I just wanted to call out that that's not a typo. I also found out recently when they released N that it actually wasn't at N that they did this, it was in Lollipop, but part of Material have made the titles in DP and not SP. So going back to what Kelly was talking about earlier today, I think this is like one of the places that kind of frustrates me the most, because you'll immediately see stuff change or not change when people change the actual size of the text on their phones. It's definitely not a typo. The next is the fab. So the fab, once again, is another one of those that almost everyone's using. This is the one that I'm using currently in this example app is actually Google's. So if most of you are using the ones that kind of came out third party before Google released their own, they may not have the same symptoms. But in the fab for Google, they have 3 different sizes. You can have mini, normal, and size auto. If you use size auto, you'll notice that it shrinks from 56 dp to 40 dp, and that's because of some code right here. And you'll see the highlighted part, which is basically the max dimension. If it's less than this magical number that they have, it becomes size mini, or otherwise it's size normal. And that dimension is 470 dp. Not really sure why that is, but really this kind of, the entire point I'm trying to make here is that like any widgets, whether it's third party or Android exclusive, like be very careful, understand what's going on, and definitely look at those things, because stuff can change in a way that you may not necessarily think is or you may not even see, but you may not think is necessarily bad for the user experience, but it could totally affect it in a negative way, especially with titles becoming smaller. So next, this is kind of hitting on some of the stuff that Google's doing. So this is like, or not just Google, but third-party developers. So if if you have used a widget and you've noticed something weird, chances are you're probably doing the same thing in your layouts, but you're just consuming someone else's code so you don't see it necessarily in front of you. So for instance, let's take the ability to have like a portrait versus a landscape layout. So as I was saying before, orientation has very little to do with the actual orientation of the phone. So if we actually decide that we want to take our portrait, and mind you, this is one activity with two different layouts. If we want to take the same activity that's in portrait and move it into split screen, we'll notice that if you have a layout that is in landscape or that uses the landscape qualifier, that will actually be inflated when you move into split screen mode. And once again, that has to do with kind of how Android looks at orientation and how it deals with height and width. So similarly, smallest width. For a long time, we've all been told smallest width was something that we would use, for instance, for tablets to make tablet support easier, because at a certain point, phones became so large or tablets became so small that we couldn't really tell the difference between them using the old type of resource qualifiers that they have, like screen size, specifically like large devices, small devices. So they told us to use smallest width, which is actually not smallest width. It just means the smallest dimension. And if you read the docs, it will say, it will never change. But in this case, we've got a tablet app, and I wanted to show that the tablet layout, even in split screen, is still targeting tablet, and then a phone layout, and that's, so the tablet one is 600 dp is the smallest width, and then we just have the standard phone layout in our standard layouts directory. And then when we move to a smaller portion, we move the split just up a little bit. We'll notice that all of a sudden we're targeting the phone, and that's because the smallest width is actually changed in this case. And I'll show a little bit more in the example of best experience on how that actually changes and how we can combat that a little bit. And then last but not least, and I'm not trying to pick on them, I actually think they did, it's like stood up pretty well considering. But custom views, like I said, third-party widgets are going to be a problem. Our own custom views that we write, they're going to definitely be not error-prone to these kind of issues. So here's basically Nest, and so you'll see that Nest, this is what it looks like in this normal phone screen, but if you go into split screen mode with it, that the UI becomes really hard to use. That radial design, though it's really gorgeous in a large screen setup, it actually becomes a little bit harder to use, a little bit clunkier. So this is another one of those where initially, we were doing a lot of things that were very specific for devices, and I'm sure that I'm going to be the first to say that I've gotten bugs where there's this Samsung Galaxy S2, and I always use that phone because it's the worst phone by far, and it caused me more problems than any other phone I've ever touched. I would make a fix that not necessarily like says if Samsung Galaxy 2 do something, but is very specific to smaller devices, and then we end up in a situation where now if it goes even smaller, I'm going to have to make another fix for that, which is just kind of leading to what I want to talk about more about responsive design. So custom views can really burn you. I'd definitely make sure and look at those. So that kind of, that's a very high level of what things can affect your design. There's a lot more that can happen from an engineering perspective, but this hopefully gets the cogs and the wheels going and thinking about all the things that maybe you've done that are phone specific, that are specific resource qualifiers that you're using that may have caused some problems or may end up causing you a lot of headache and having to triage a lot of bugs later on down the road. So next we'll go into actually upgrading multi-window. Google does a great job on the docs, so I'm going to try to skip over, or not skip over, but gloss over some of the stuff that's kind of not as important. The big things that I really wanted to talk about is specifically if you're not going to decide to target NuGet yet, but you're less than API 24. I have very sad news for you. Yes, your app may support multi-window even if you're lower than API 24, if you target lower than API 24. Not to scare you too much, or not that this makes much of a difference, but it's only split screen and freeform mode. As I said, picture-in-picture is not in something that they're supporting right now. So in essence, if someone has an N phone and your app doesn't target 24, you could still be running. And that's because of the very bland and boring example of this main activity that's a launcher activity. So we look at this launcher activity. There's really nothing fancy about it. I mean, this is something that all of us, I think, are pretty like Android 101. This is kind of the stuff you learn. And you're definitely not crazy. There's nothing special about it. But the problem is that it lacks the screen orientation lock on it. And that one key fact right there will mean that Android will tell you when a user tries to put your app into multi-window, will allow them to put your app into multi-window. It will give them the caveat that this doesn't technically support multi-window, but it will still allow them to get into multi-window. So I'm not necessarily advocating that we go and all put lock portrait or lock landscape for all of our activities, but I do want to make that very clear that, for instance, Twitter was another one of those that in pre-end previews, you could definitely put Twitter into multi-window mode really easily. And then immediately as N released, they had a release, and now you can't put it in multi-window mode anymore. So they obviously, I think, got a ton of bugs probably from a bunch of developers like ourselves who are all using Nougat on 6Ps and 5Xs, or they just decided they found them themselves. But this is definitely a classic case of you're kind of need to do something actionable to turn this actually off. Yep.
Do I define any of those and then the system blocks on end, or some of them still allowed? Or
so from what I've found, there hasn't been one that will. So if you use this, the best ones to use are landscape, portrait, and locked. I think some of the user ones, I haven't looked into those ones as much, but the ones you're generally going to use, like portrait and landscape, will definitely lock them. But yeah, that's a good question. So if you're targeting 24 and above, as I said before, multi-window is actually enabled by default. So just targeting N and then saying, all right, I'm done, it shouldn't be turned on anymore, doesn't help you. So you actually are going to need to do something. So if you want to do that, you really need to think about two things, whether or not you want it to be app-wide or activity-specific. And the reason I say that is because this feature is actually one that literally you can turn off the entire app from being multi-window mode, which is really nice, or you can specify specific activities that are in multi-window mode. The caveat to that is that if you start an activity in multi-window mode, any activity after that has to be in multi-window mode. So that means that if you say have two activities, A and B, A has allows multi-window mode, B doesn't, but you start B from A, B is going to start in multi-window, no problem. So be aware of that when you're actually kind of going through things. It definitely can cause a little bit of weirdness. I would suggest potentially just turning it on because, as we've seen with, I don't know if you guys have seen or heard, but with Andromeda, they're going to cross Chrome and Android and have this new PC like tablet thing that's going to come out, and that just means closer to the convergence of Android and Chrome OS. So in order to do that, first and foremost, you go to Application if you want to turn off or turn on multi-window on application mode, and you would add the resizable activity and then either true or false depending on which one you want to support. Like I said, pretty easy. And then same with activities. Go to your activity in your manifest, add the resizable activity, true or false, and you're done. You either are supporting it so it's more verbose so that someone knows you are actually supporting it, or you've turned it off altogether. Now there are a couple things that we can do differently with these modes, specifically freeform mode and split screen. So in freeform, we actually have the ability to do default width and default height, gravity and min height and min width. So basically this means that when the user starts your activity into a specific, into multi-window, whether it's freeform or split screen, in freeform mode, you have the ability to actually set the default height and width. So that activity will snap to a specific default height and width, and will actually snap to a part in the screen depending on the gravity you set. If you do the min height and width, it will actually just allow your app to basically stay that height, but if a user the user will be able to continue to actually squeeze the app down. And if they do, then your app will just be scrollable the entire time. And similarly in split screen, you have a couple options, but not as many. You can just set min height and min width, and those are also in DP values. So that's kind of how you would support it out of the box from setting up in your manifest. In your activity and your fragment, which is obviously the next big question of how does this impact my code. First major thing is I'd say don't unregister things on pause anymore. This is one that they've been pretty good about explaining to people, but I just want to continue to highlight. This is not necessarily a change in the documentation. Google has always had on pause as being partially obscured by another app, so it can be potentially visible even without multi-window. We're normally not used to seeing that type of thing in development and in production. And to kind of show a little bit of an example of how this works or what this looks like. Once again, I'm not trying to pick on Slack, but it's obvious that like this is just one of those things, like we're all used to unregistering most everything on pause. It's been safe. It's been in a lot of documentation, including some of the stuff that Square has. So this is a video that I captured of going into multi-window mode. And when I move to the other side of the app, you'll see that all of a sudden the screen disappears, all the content disappears, and then it reappears when I touch back on the Slack apps page. I'll play that one more time just so that everyone can see it. Yeah, and this is one that was also kind of, I think, for legacy apps, this is a little bit scary because this may mean refactoring quite a bit of code and changing how you deal with data, where you place data. Cool. So the next one is don't do too much on resume. So because of the way that Android is now going to be handling your apps in split screen and multi-window mode, it's not necessarily a probability. It is going to happen that your app is going to go through the life cycle of on resume more frequently. In fact, every single time that you resize your app, it's going to go basically, as long as you don't handle configuration changes, it'll kill the app, rebuild your app, reinflate all your layouts, and then go back through your on resume pass. Now, if you're just in split screen mode and you're touching, and the user's touching between apps, 1 and 2, then it actually goes between on resume, on pause, on resume, on pause. So if you're doing lots of loading, if you're doing network intensive stuff, if you're marshaling data and then unmarshaling it on resume, I don't know why you would most of the time, but if you are, potentially here is going to cause you a lot of problems or potentially eat up a lot of your users' resources, which makes people unhappy, and then they'll delete your app and stuff like that. So basically, we need to find a better place to do things instead of on resume. So next, kind of last for this section, was just going to hit on a couple of the new methods. I don't really go over these too much, but for the new methods, we get basically most of the stuff you would expect to get. You can tell whether or not you're in multi-window mode. You can get actual callbacks when you're in multi-window mode for fragments as well. And then for picture-in-picture, you can see when that mode's changed as well. There's nothing really special, about those, but we have those definitely for our use, which is nice. So one of the biggest parts of this that I really wanted to hit home on is whether or not you're going to be making config changes or you're going to be letting Android handle your config changes. This is the one big thing that you're going to have to figure out. One of the two big things you're going to have to figure out and understand what the implications of doing such are. So let's say that you want to go down the case of actually handling your configuration changes. If you've never done that before, I'm going to go through a small tutorial on how that works, but then talk a little bit more about the implications. So in order to do that, first and foremost, there's not a new config change if you are using that. You are handling config changes today. Google actually suggests you use all 4 of these as the config change options. So screen size, small screen size, screen layout, and orientation. A lot of that's, I think, because there's not really much they needed to change in order to make something that's supported. They're just allowing the apps to resize themselves now. So if you are handling these config changes basically out of the box, you'll still continue to get the same configuration changes, and it should be like magic. And then the only other thing you'll need to do is obviously override the onConfiguration change method. This is where all the configuration changes will actually come through, and you can see those in the new config parameter that comes through. And if there's anything you need to do in onConfiguration change, update the UI, deal with data, this is going to be the place that you're going to handle those things. So the pros and cons for this, really, if you decide to handle configuration changes, that means that you're just going to be able to have one layout potentially. You could have one layout that could be flexible enough to handle dealing with all the different orientations and screen sizes and all that stuff, which is really nice. And you'll also have to be forced to figure out how to deal with marshaling your data a little bit more, especially considering if your activity just gets absolutely killed at some point. Without dealing with configuration changes, that means that Android doesn't handle, with a little bit of help from yourselves, saving stuff and save instance state. Doesn't help you do a lot of those things. And as well, there's no reinflation, so you save a lot of potential frames lost over reinflating all the XML that you potentially are going to be going back over when they recreate your activity. The cons on it, basically invalidation can cause redrawing. So if you just have one layout, you could potentially redraw a whole bunch. So if as your screen changes size and the app will naturally invalidate the whole view tree, depending on if it needs to. You could also be burned by that from a performance perspective. Also, if you're not handling configuration changes and you want to, there's a lot of re-architecture and upkeep that may end up happening with that. And last but not least, if you're already handling config changes and now you have to add new ones, you may have to make different kind of pathways or different code paths for each of those, which can be frustrating and add more potentials for aggression and other issues. Now, if you want to let Android handle config changes, it's nice. We just get to carry on and do what we've been doing for a long time. The only difference here, what I would say, is that resource qualifiers become your best friends. So you're going to learn them really well, and we'll talk a little bit about what you can do to make that easier. This is obviously the easiest approach. There's less engineering up front, but there's like inherent cost that's going to happen. So if you let Android marshal your data, if you pretty much you're going to have to at this point say it's going to inflate your layouts. Speaking of which, if you want to understand after this talk more about what layout inflation is going to cost you, tomorrow morning I think there is a really good talk about layout inflation that's going to happen. So I think Michael Bailey's giving that, so I definitely suggest going to that if you want to understand more about what this is going to cost you. But yeah, that's basically the long and the short of it is like between layout inflation and marshaling your data, if you allow Android to handle that, it can be really basically resource intensive. I'm not saying that one approach is better than the other. To be honest, I've kind of mulled this over for a while. I think really a hybrid approach could be best, but we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. And then one of the last really coolest features, and I still haven't found a really amazing reason for someone to do this, is adjacent activities. So I have another video to show. And in this case, we have two activities. And what will happen is I'll start the activity up in normal phone mode, and then I put it into split screen. And then I'll try to start the same activity, and you'll notice that it actually starts in the lower half of the split screen. So this is a really cool thing that you can do and actually is really easy to implement. You just need to add the flags activity new task, flag activity clear task, and then those are old that we already know about. And then the new one, which is flag activity launch adjacent. This will give you the ability to actually launch that activity in the same, so your apps in split screen mode would take up both sides of the split, which is kind of cool. And when it's not in split screen, it will act as normal. It basically ignores that other flag. This is really cool. I just haven't found any really good use cases for why you'd want to have your two activities open up. Also, some of the things that I could see going wrong with this is if you interact with the database and you're assuming that only one activity is going to communicate with the database, you could get yourself into a lot of locked position. If you're not synchronizing, you can kind of mess yourself up there, but other things. Yeah?
Can the two activities talk to each other?
So there's not a way that they have, you would have to utilize some of the stuff we already have in Android, but there's not like a defined way. You'd have to do something either, to be honest, one of the ones that I like the most is just potentially using some pub sub, having them both register the same bus and then just communicate over that. I think it's probably the most effective without having to put a ton of boilerplate, because there's other things you could do, but there's nothing new that they've added that helps us allow these things to communicate with each other. So cool. So that's upgrading to multi-window. We went over a little bit of actually how to make it work in legacy, or how it works in legacy apps, how to enable it, how to deal with what's going on in activity and fragments, configuration changes, and adjacent activities. So last but not least is dealing with the best experience for multi-window. So the nice thing that I'm really happy with is that this is not brand new for even Google to think about. Maybe the writing's been on the wall for them the whole time, and they knew that this was the approach that they were going to be taking, but they have a really great material page for responsive UI. This will help you through kind of some of the initial conversations, especially a great resource to point to designers. It's not necessarily as much for us, I think, something that would be beneficial in our day-to-day, other than understanding what kind of goes into the design of responsive UI. It talks a lot about breakpoints, grids, breakpoints, which is very similar to a lot of the stuff that we've dealt with on the web. And that kind of leads me to my next point, which is basically to start adopting responsive UI patterns. This is something that, like I said, the web has had for a long, long time. And because we're just now getting this on Android, and we've also probably dealt with things in less of a responsive way in the past, the quicker that you do this, the easier it will make you to start supporting things like multi-window. And if the writing truly is on the wall and they cross Chrome OS and Androids, that we have Android apps that are truly supposed to be on computers and personal computers, then we'll see more and more of this as the years go on. So if Android handles configuration changes, and I have no clue why that question mark got put in there, I'm sure I was doing something fun, then really the biggest thing that I would suggest to you is to lean on the resource qualifiers. And for anybody who doesn't know what the resource qualifiers are, this is a normal project for Android. And there's the resource directory, and each of those have a subdirectory that allow you to hold things like drawables, layouts, values, colors, all that kinds of fun stuff. And in those directories, you can actually add qualifiers to them that allow Android to pick and choose which of those resources that's going to use at any specific time when configuration changes happen. And in kind of playing around, and I'm not saying that these are the ones that I would suggest everyone go home and use them wildly and that they swear by them. The ones that I've found in kind of playing around with multi-window for phones kind of look like this. So we'd have the normal layout subdirectory, and then you have something like your tablet smallest width 600 dp. And then what I've actually found was that on the 6P and the 5X, and I know this is very device specific, but it's to drive home a point that on phones it's going to be different and potentially could act differently. I've noticed that no matter where when I'm in multi-window mode, no matter where I go to, that the app or that the configuration will always tell me that the smallest width is 330 dp, or at least in the 330 dp bucket. So what I've done was I've added another configuration to make that combination, which is the available height. So in this, you'll see that basically I have kind of this nice combination of it's got to be in the smallest width of 300 dp, and then also has to have an available height of, in this case, 230 or 320 or 400. And that looks something like this for the values that I have. And to kind of show why it is that I ended up going with these combinations, above on the top is the smallest width, and on the bottom is the height of what the view actually responded, or the app responded to me with for its configuration. And so in essence, at a certain point, the phone stopped telling me that its smallest width was changing, even though its height was definitely changing. It was really strange. I saw this on tablets as well, so I don't think that it's necessarily a oddity between how the 6Ps is responding to smallest width, but definitely something to look into and potentially. Basically, what I'm saying is that there's not going to be one set of resources that we're going to need for configuration changes if Android deals with your layouts. I would just look into using pretty much anything in the smallest width and height ranges. Those are probably the best for you. So if you decide to handle your config changes, and this is the one that I came up with last night at 12 o'clock on the flight from Austin. One of the things I found out was that you could actually potentially do this with like a coordinator layout. So if you're not familiar with the coordinator layout, you basically allow so the coordinator layout has these things called behaviors, and in those behaviors, you can define things like the ability for a view to depend on another view. And so this is the kind of a code snippet from those views. In this case, I have I think it was just a piece of text that was depending on an image view. So you'd override this method on your behavior and your custom behavior that you made, and then the next one you would actually override is your on-dependent view change. And this is basically what's going to end up happening is as it iterates over all of the views, the coordinator layout, it will iterate over all of them and say if there's anything that I depend on that I know that I actually will deal with if I depend on it, then I'll actually tell them that hey, something's changed with this, or I'll at least update the behavior that something's changed, allowing them to do whatever behavior you'd like. And so in that case, what I did was come up with basically a helper method to give me a certain breakpoint that I had, and took a configuration from the current configuration that we have and figure out the smallest screen. So in the first line, if you haven't done it before, you can actually get the configuration details from your resources. From there, you can actually get your smallest width, and then from, the smallest screen width. And then from there, basically I go ahead and grab this helper method that I've created, the smallest width bucket that I want to do, and then I do the logic basically anywhere in these breakpoints for each bucket. So it was kind of weird the way I did it, and it was also very kind of trite, so I haven't seen it in a like super complex, although I'm gonna now go and try with some of our UI and some of our apps. But basically I did it to show and hide some text depending on where the split was in the screen, so that you could see if potentially there's not enough room or real estate to show a certain piece of text or show some buttons, that you may hide them or show them in a different way. So I thought this was kind of cool. I don't know, honestly, there's some caveats to this that I've not worked out totally. One of them is the fact that you can only depend yourself on a view. You can't depend yourself on the core layout, so you couldn't do something at the root of the parent that's holding the layout, which was kind of weird. So that means you always have to be dependent on some child view or some view inside of your root, which is kind of crazy, but it makes sense. It's probably just not set up to work that way. So as we talk about best experience, like I said, it's going to be a holistic thing. It's not necessarily just something that has to happen from us. It has to start with design, product. Even the people who are, the CEOs who are making kind of the big changes have to realize that this is going to be kind of going forward something that we're going to have to always think about and always deal with. In doing that, what I would say is definitely figure out where your breakpoints, get with your design team, kind of come up with a responsive process, responsive UI for yourself, come up with the breakpoints that you're going to be using, and figure out some unique way. And I'm actually love to hear more as people go on and try to support multi-window, how they make this stuff happen, because it's definitely in its infancy, and I've had enough time to evangelize it at my company, but I'm still trying to see how it will go. So I definitely would love to hear more about that. And then lastly, if you decide to go with handling configuration changes yourself, explore new technologies that we have, new layouts, new things that you could potentially use to help keep from having multiple layouts, because I always think that's definitely a hard thing to do, is to manage an exorbitant amount of layouts. But if you do decide to go down the layout path, use the resource qualifiers. They're definitely the best and easiest way for you to get off on the ground and get yourself running on anything involving multi-window. And then kind of tying all this back in together, one of the things that Google harped on in a really awesome blog that they wrote was testing. And I would say test with and without targeting N. Like, you never know, especially if you're not planning on targeting N anytime soon. Like, there's a few apps that we have that we're not targeting N on, but we have branches that are targeting N specifically to look into these issues. If you're not doing that, do that already. A design audit's always great, especially considering that we're going to be dealing with more and more changes. If you get a chance, look into things like fluid layouts. They're potentially they're a stepping stone to responsive UI, but they may help you. And always think about future-proofing and leaning on resources and configuration qualifiers if you need to. And that's all I have today. Thank you guys for coming.